The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Kingston, Nevada, and Delilah Durant knew, without looking, that another man had just lost his life over a handful of silver coins. She pressed herself against the rough wooden planks of the general store, her heart hammering as boots thundered past her hiding spot, and wondered how much longer she could keep running before her own luck ran out. It was the summer of 1878, and Kingston had grown from a quiet mining settlement into something wilder, more dangerous. The silver strikes had brought desperate men from every corner of the country, and with them came the kind of violence that turned neighbors into strangers and strangers into corpses. Delilah had arrived 3 months ago with nothing but a carpetbag, and the small gold ring her grandmother had pressed into her palm the day before she died. That ring was all she had left of home, of Virginia, of the life she had known before her father's debts had swallowed everything whole. She waited until the shouting faded before stepping out onto the boardwalk, brushing red dust from her faded blue dress. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the main street into a shimmering river of heat. Across the way, she could see Dr. Raymond Pierce kneeling beside a figure sprawled in the dirt. The doctor's face was grim as he slowly shook his head and stood, wiping his hands on a cloth that was already stained dark. Delilah's throat tightened. She knew that man. Thomas Whitley had worked in the stamp mill, had a wife and 2 small children living in a tent at the edge of town. She had seen them at the general store just yesterday, the wife's face hollow with hunger, the children thin and quiet in a way children should never be. "Nothing to see here, folks," Sheriff Dawson called out, his voice carrying across the street. "Get back to your business." But Delilah could not move. She watched as 2 men lifted Thomas Whitley's body and carried it toward the undertaker's parlor. She thought about those children, about that wife who would soon be a widow with no means of survival in this harsh place. The town had no charity, no mercy for those who could not pay their way. She had learned that lesson quickly enough when she had arrived, nearly starving, and found that every kindness came with a price. She touched the ring through the fabric of her pocket, feeling its small, solid weight. It was all she had, but what good was a ring when people were dying? The thought followed her as she made her way back to the boarding house where she rented a tiny room on the 3rd floor. Mrs. Chen, the owner, gave her a stern look as she climbed the stairs. "Rent is due tomorrow," the older woman said. "No exceptions." "I know," Delilah replied quietly. She always paid on time, using the meager wages she earned taking in mending and laundry. It was barely enough to keep her fed and sheltered, but it was honest work, and that mattered. In her room, she sat on the narrow bed and pulled the ring from her pocket. The gold caught the light from the small window, gleaming warmly. It had been her grandmother's wedding ring, worn smooth by decades of wear. Delilah could remember sitting on her grandmother's lap as a child, twisting the ring around and around on that wrinkled finger, listening to stories about true love and faithfulness, about how her grandfather had saved for months to buy this simple band. "Real love is sacrifice," her grandmother had told her. "It is giving when you have nothing left to give. Remember that, child." Delilah closed her fingers around the ring. She thought about Thomas Whitley's children, about how they would be sent away or left to starve because there was no money for a proper burial, no money for the funeral that would give their father dignity in death. The undertaker, Mr. Morrison, was not a cruel man, but he was a businessman. No payment meant no service, and that meant a pauper's grave outside of town, unmarked and forgotten. Before she could talk herself out of it, Delilah stood and left the boarding house, walking quickly through the evening heat toward the undertaker's parlor. The sign above the door swung slightly in the hot breeze. She pushed the door open and a small bell chimed. Mr. Morrison looked up from his desk, his expression polite but weary. "Miss Durrant, what can I do for you?" "Thomas Whitley," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The man who was shot today. I want to pay for his burial." The undertaker's eyebrows rose. "That is very generous, but the cost for a proper funeral and burial is $30. Casket, grave digging, the service itself. $30. It might as well have been $300. Delilah swallowed hard and pulled the ring from her pocket. "I have this. It is real gold. Surely it is worth enough." Mr. Morrison took the ring, examining it carefully in the lamplight. He was quiet for a long moment, and Delilah held her breath. Finally, he nodded slowly. "It is good quality. I can accept this as payment. Mr. Whitley will have a proper Christian burial tomorrow afternoon." Relief flooded through her, even as her chest tightened with loss. "Thank you," she whispered. "Please do not tell anyone where the money came from. Just say an anonymous benefactor paid for it." "As you wish," Mr. Morrison said gently. He seemed to understand that this was no small sacrifice. "You are doing a kind thing, Miss Durrant." Delilah left before the tears could fall, walking blindly through the darkening streets. She had done the right thing, she knew that. But the ring had been her last connection to her grandmother, to the promise that love and goodness still existed in the world. Now it was gone, traded for a stranger's final rest. She did not see the man watching from across the street, leaning against a hitching post with his hat pulled low. Dane Northwood had been on his way to the saloon when he had noticed the young woman entering the undertaker's parlor. Curiosity had made him wait, and he had been close enough to the window to overhear the entire conversation through the thin walls. Dane was a cowboy, a ranch hand who worked on the Triple J spread about 10 miles outside of Kingston. He had come into town to collect supplies and enjoy a rare evening off, but now all thoughts of whiskey and card games had vanished from his mind. He stared at the undertaker's door, his jaw tight with an emotion he could not quite name. He had known Thomas Whitley, had shared drinks with him a few times. The man had been decent, hardworking, someone who did not deserve a bullet over a gambling dispute. But what struck Dane to his core was what he had just witnessed. That woman, who clearly had little enough herself, had given up what was obviously a treasured possession to ensure a stranger received dignity in death. Dane pushed off from the hitching post and walked slowly toward the boarding house, staying far enough back that Delilah Durrant would not notice him. He watched her climb the steps and disappear inside, and then he stood there in the street, thinking hard. He was 26 years old and had spent the last 8 years drifting from ranch to ranch, town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He had seen cruelty and kindness in equal measure, but he had never seen anything quite like what he had just witnessed. There was something about that kind of selflessness that reached into a part of him he had thought long dead. The next day, Dane found himself at Thomas Whitley's funeral instead of heading back to the ranch. The service was small but dignified, held in the little church at the edge of town. Mrs. Whitley sat in the front row with her children, her face stunned with grief and confusion. She had been told that an anonymous donor had paid for everything, and the relief mixed with sorrow in her expression was painful to see. Dane stood at the back, his hat in his hands, scanning the sparse crowd. He spotted Delilah Durrant sitting alone near the middle, her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap. She wore the same faded blue dress from yesterday, and in the light streaming through the church's small windows, he could see the careful mending in the fabric, the way she had made do with what little she had. After the service, as people filed out into the harsh sunlight, Dane made his way toward her. She was walking quickly, as if trying to leave before anyone could speak to her, but he caught up in a few long strides. "Miss Durrant," he said, and she turned, startled. Up close, he could see that her eyes were a remarkable shade of green, and her hair, though pinned back severely, had strands of copper that caught the light. She was younger than he had first thought, probably around 22 or 23, with fine features and skin that had not yet been roughened by years of desert sun. "Yes," she said, her voice cautious. "Do I know you? Name is Dane Northwood," he said, extending his hand. She shook it briefly, her grip light but firm. "I work at the Triple J Ranch. I knew Thomas Whitley a bit." "Oh," she said, and something in her expression softened. "He seemed like a good man. It is a terrible thing that happened." "It is," Dane agreed. He hesitated, unsure how to say what he wanted to say without embarrassing her. "I was in town yesterday evening. I happened to be near the undertaker's parlor." Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed immediately by a flash of alarm. "You heard?" "I did," he admitted. "I was not trying to eavesdrop, but the walls are thin." Delilah looked away, her cheeks coloring. "I asked Mr. Morrison not to say anything." "He did not," Dane assured her quickly. "It was just bad luck that I was standing in the right place to overhear, or maybe it was good luck. I do not rightly know yet." She frowned slightly, puzzled, and he rushed on before he could lose his nerve. "That was the most selfless thing I have seen anyone do in a long time," he said quietly. "Maybe ever. You gave up something that mattered to you, something you probably could not afford to give up for a stranger, for his family. That is remarkable, Miss Durrant." Her eyes shone with sudden tears, but she blinked them back. "It was just a ring. What good is a ring when children might starve?" "It was not just a ring," Dane said. "I could see that in the way you held it, in your voice when you offered it. It meant something to you." Delilah was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "It was my grandmother's wedding ring, the only thing I had left of her, of my family. But she would have understood. She taught me that love is sacrifice." The words hit Dane like a physical blow. He stared at this woman, this stranger who had given up her most precious possession for someone else's peace, and felt something shift deep in his chest. He had spent years building walls around his heart, protecting himself from disappointment and loss, but in that moment, those walls began to crack. "That is true love right there," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The real kind. Not the fairy tale nonsense, but the kind that costs something. The kind that matters." Delilah looked up at him, really looked at him, and Dane felt the full force of her attention like sunlight breaking through clouds. There was intelligence in those green eyes, and pain, and a strength that he recognized because he carried his own version of it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding. Let me buy you dinner," Dane heard himself say. "Please. I would like to hear your story if you are willing to share it." She hesitated, wariness flickering across her face. He understood that too. A woman alone in a town like Kingston had to be careful, had to guard herself against men who might take advantage. "Just dinner," he said quickly. "At the hotel restaurant where it is public and proper. I give you my word that I will be a perfect gentleman." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because after a moment she nodded. "All right, but I cannot stay long. I have mending to finish tonight." They walked together to the Kingston Hotel, the nicest establishment in town, though that was not saying much. The restaurant was half full with miners and businessmen, and Dane led Delilah to a table near the window where the late afternoon light spilled across the worn tablecloth. Over plates of beef stew and cornbread, she told him her story. How her father had been a merchant in Richmond, Virginia, successful until a series of bad investments had ruined him. How he had died of a heart attack when the creditors came to take everything, leaving Delilah and her mother with nothing. How her mother had passed away the following winter, worn down by grief and hardship. How her grandmother had given her the ring and the last of her savings, enough for a train ticket west and a few weeks of survival. I thought I could make a fresh start here, Delilah said, stirring her stew without eating. Find work, maybe as a teacher or a shopkeeper's assistant, but there are no jobs for women here except in the saloons, and I would not do that. So I take in washing and mending, and it is enough to keep me fed and housed, but only just. You have no other family? Dane asked. No one who could help you? She shook her head. My mother was an only child, and my father's family disowned him when he went bankrupt. I have no one. The loneliness in her voice made Dane's chest ache. He knew what it was like to be alone, to have no one to turn to when the world became too hard to bear. His own parents had died when he was 15, his father in a range war and his mother from pneumonia the same winter. He had been raising himself ever since, moving from place to place, never quite belonging anywhere. I am sorry, he said. That is a heavy burden to carry. Everyone has their burdens, Delilah said, but her eyes were grateful. What is your story, Mr. Northwood? How did you end up working on a ranch in Nevada? So he told her about growing up in Texas, about losing his parents, about the years of drifting and searching for something he could never quite name. He told her about the Triple J, where he had been working for the past 6 months, longer than he had stayed anywhere in years. The owner, Jacob Jensen, is a fair man, Dane said. He pays decent wages and does not work his men to death. It is as good a place as any, I suppose. But you are not planning to stay, Delilah said, and it was not a question. She had heard the restlessness in his voice. I never do, Dane admitted. I get to feeling penned in, like the walls are closing in, and then I have to move on. What are you looking for? She asked. It was a simple question, but it cut right to the heart of him. Dane looked out the window at the dusty street, at the people hurrying about their business, and tried to find an answer. I do not know, he said finally. I thought I would know it when I found it, but so far nothing has felt right. Nothing has felt like home. Delilah nodded slowly, as if she understood. I feel that way too sometimes, like I am wandering through a life that does not quite fit, waiting for something to change. Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment something passed between them. A recognition, an understanding that went deeper than words. Two lost souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of places. The meal ended too soon, and Dane walked Delilah back to her boarding house as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. At the door, she turned to him, and he could see the uncertainty in her face. Thank you for dinner, she said. It was kind of you. Can I see you again? Dane asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Tomorrow, maybe. I have to go back to the ranch tonight, but I could come to town tomorrow afternoon. Delilah bit her lip, considering. Then, slowly, she smiled, and it transformed her whole face, making her look younger and lighter. I would like that. Meet me at the church at 3 o'clock, Dane suggested. We could go for a walk, maybe out by the creek where it is cooler. All right, she agreed. 3 o'clock. Dane rode back to the ranch that night with his mind full of Delilah Durant. He thought about her sacrifice, her strength, the loneliness that echoed his own. He thought about the way she had smiled at him, tentative but genuine, and the way his heart had responded like a match struck in darkness. The next afternoon, he was back in Kingston at 2:30, his horse freshly groomed and himself cleaned up as best he could manage. He had even shaved, which earned him some ribbing from the other ranch hands, but he did not care. When Delilah appeared at 3 o'clock, wearing the same blue dress but with her hair loose around her shoulders, he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They walked along the creek that ran through a narrow canyon east of town, following a well-worn path that offered shade from the cottonwood trees. The water was low this time of year, barely more than a trickle, but it created a ribbon of green in the otherwise brown landscape. "Tell me more about your grandmother," Dane said as they walked. "The one who gave you the ring." Delilah's face softened with memory. "Her name was Margaret. She was the strongest person I ever knew. She survived the death of 2 children, outlived my grandfather by 15 years, and never once complained about her lot in life. She used to tell me that happiness was a choice, that you could find joy even in the hardest circumstances if you looked for it." "Sounds like you take after her," Dane observed. "I try," Delilah said. "Some days are easier than others. Yesterday, after I left the undertaker's, I cried for an hour, not because I regretted what I had done, but because I missed her so much. That ring was the last piece of her I had, and now it is gone." Dane stopped walking and turned to face her. "I want to buy it back for you." Delilah's eyes widened. "What? No, you cannot do that." "Why not?" he asked. "I have been saving my wages for months. I have enough." "Because it would not be right," she said firmly. "I made that choice freely. I do not regret it, and I do not want you spending your hard-earned money to undo it." "But it mattered to you," Dane insisted. "It was your grandmother's ring. You should not have had to give it up." "But I did," Delilah said gently, reaching out to touch his arm. "And that is all right. Things are just things, Dane. They can be lost or given away or stolen. What matters is what we do with them while we have them. I used that ring to help someone, to give a family peace in their grief. That is what my grandmother would have wanted. That is what love is supposed to do." Dane looked down at her hand on his arm, at the earnest expression on her face, and felt something click into place inside him. This woman, with her fierce kindness and her unshakable principles, was what he had been searching for all these years without knowing it. Not a place, but a person. Not a destination, but a home. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "Do you know that?" Delilah blushed and pulled her hand back, looking flustered. "I am just ordinary. I do what anyone with a conscience would do." "That is where you are wrong," Dane said. "Most people would have kept that ring. Most people would have looked the other way and told themselves it was not their problem. But you did not. You saw a need and you filled it, even though it cost you dearly. That is extraordinary." They continued walking, the conversation drifting to lighter topics, but the weight of what had passed between them lingered in the air. Dane told her stories about life on the ranch, about the ornery cattle and the wild horses that roamed the hills. Delilah told him about the people in the boarding house, the strange characters and their various dramas. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the canyon, they turned back toward town. At the edge of Kingston, Dane caught her hand, stopping her. "Can I see you again?" he asked. "I know I am just a cowboy with no prospects, but I would like to spend more time with you if you will let me." Delilah looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face. "You have more prospects than you think," she said softly. "You have honesty and kindness and a good heart. Those things matter more than money or position." "Is that a yes?" Dane asked, hope rising in his chest. "That is a yes," she confirmed, and her smile was like sunrise. Over the following weeks, Dane made the ride into Kingston every chance he got. Sometimes it was just for an hour or two, stolen between work and sleep. Sometimes he managed a whole afternoon or evening. They walked along the creek, sat on the bench outside the church, shared meals at the hotel restaurant. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and dreams. Delilah told him about her childhood in Virginia, about the grand house they had lived in before her father's downfall, about the books she had read and the places she had dreamed of visiting. She confessed that she had once wanted to be a writer, to tell stories that would move people and make them think, but that life had taken her in a different direction. Dane told her about growing up on a hardscrabble ranch in Texas, about learning to ride before he could raid, about the freedom and loneliness of life on the range. He told her about the men he had worked with, good and bad, and about the places he had seen in his years of drifting. "Do you still want to move on?" Delilah asked him one evening as they sat watching the sunset from a rocky outcrop overlooking the town. "Or have you found what you were looking for?" Dane looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the copper in her hair, at the gentle curve of her smile. "I think I have," he said quietly. "I think I found it the day I saw you walk into that undertaker's parlor." Delilah's breath caught, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then, slowly, she reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I think I found something too," she whispered. "Something I did not even know I was missing." They sat there as the stars began to appear overhead, hands clasped, hearts opening to possibilities neither had dared to imagine just weeks before. But life in Kingston was not getting any easier. The violence in town seemed to escalate with each passing week. More shootings, more robberies, more desperation as the easy silver played out and men realized their dreams of wealth were slipping away. The boarding house where Delilah lived became increasingly dangerous as tensions rose and fights broke out among the residents. One night, Dane arrived to find Delilah waiting for him outside, her face pale and frightened. "There was a fight," she told him, her voice shaking. "Two of the men who live on my floor, one of them had a knife. Mrs. Chen broke it up, but it was terrifying." Dane felt a cold rage settle in his gut. "You cannot stay there anymore. It is not safe." "I do not have anywhere else to go," Delilah said helplessly. "I cannot afford anything better, and there are no other respectable boarding houses in town." "Come to the ranch," Dane said impulsively. "Jacob's wife, Sarah, is always looking for help with the house and the cooking. They have a spare room in the main house. You would be safe there, and you would have steady work and better wages than you are making now." Delilah looked uncertain. "I do not know. Would it be proper? What would people think?" "There are 3 other women working at the ranch," Dane assured her. "Sarah Jensen runs the household, and there are 2 other women who help with cooking and cleaning. It is all perfectly respectable. Please, Delilah, I cannot stand the thought of you in danger." She looked at him, at the fear and worry clear in his eyes, and made her decision. "All right. I will talk to the Jensens. If they are willing to hire me, I will take the position." The next day, Dane brought Jacob and Sarah Jensen into town to meet Delilah. Sarah was a warm, practical woman in her early 40s, with shrewd eyes and a kind smile. She took one look at Delilah's neat appearance and careful manners and hired her on the spot. "We can always use another pair of capable hands," Sarah said. "The wages are $20 a month plus room and board. You would help with cooking, cleaning, and whatever else needs doing around the house. Can you handle that?" "Yes, madam," Delilah said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you so much." Within 2 days, she had packed up her few belongings and moved to the Triple J Ranch. The ranch house was a sprawling adobe structure that had been expanded over the years, with thick walls that kept out the heat, and a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Delilah's room was small but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the corrals and the rolling hills beyond. Life at the ranch was harder work than taking in mending, but it was also more rewarding. Delilah learned to cook for 30 ranch hands, to manage the massive laundry, to organize the household stores and plan meals around what was available. Sarah Jensen became not just an employer but a friend, teaching her the skills she needed and treating her with respect and kindness. And Dane was there, close by, visible throughout the day as he worked with the cattle and horses. They could not spend as much time alone together as they had in town, propriety and work schedules limiting their interactions, but just seeing him across the yard or sharing a smile over the dinner table was enough to make Delilah's heart sing. The other ranch hands noticed, of course. It was impossible to hide the way Dane's eyes followed Delilah whenever she was near, or the way she lit up when he entered a room. Most of them were good-natured about it, teasing Dane mercilessly but leaving Delilah alone out of respect. There was one exception. Wade Garrison, the ranch foreman, watched Delilah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He was in his mid-30s, a hard man with cold eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness. He had been foreman at the Triple J for 5 years, and he ran the operation with an iron fist that Jacob Jensen seemed content to allow. "You watch yourself around Wade," Sarah warned Delilah one afternoon as they worked in the kitchen. "He has a mean streak, and he does not like it when he does not get what he wants." "Has he caused trouble before?" Delilah asked, kneading bread dough with more force than necessary. "Let us just say that the last young woman who worked here left suddenly after Wade took too much interest in her," Sarah said carefully. "Jacob spoke to him about it, but Wade is too valuable to the ranch operation for Jacob to risk losing him. Just be careful." Delilah promised she would, but she could feel Wade's eyes on her whenever he was near, and it made her skin crawl. She made sure to never be alone with him, to always have Sarah or one of the other women nearby when he was around. Dane noticed too. "If he bothers you, you tell me immediately," he said one evening when they managed to steal a few minutes alone on the porch after dinner. "I do not care if he is the foreman. He has no right to make you uncomfortable." "I will be careful," Delilah promised. "Sarah is watching out for me too." But trouble came anyway, as it always seemed to in that hard country. One afternoon, Delilah was in the barn gathering eggs from the chickens that roosted in the loft when Wade appeared in the doorway, blocking the light. "Miss Durant," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "I have been hoping to get you alone." Delilah's heart began to pound. She clutched the egg basket and tried to keep her voice steady. "I am working, Mr. Garrison, if you will excuse me." "Now, do not be like that," Wade said, moving closer. "I have been nothing but friendly to you." "The least you could do is be friendly back." "I have been perfectly polite," Delilah said, backing toward the ladder that led to the loft. "Now please let me pass." "You think you are too good for me." Wade's expression darkened. "I see the way you look at Northwood like he hung the moon." "He is just a drifter, girl. No future, no prospects. I am the foreman of this ranch. I could give you a real life." "I am not interested," Delilah said firmly, though fear was making her hands shake. "Please leave me alone." Wade lunged forward, grabbing her arm. The egg basket fell, eggs smashing on the barn floor. Delilah cried out, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "You are going to learn some manners," Wade snarled, pulling her toward him. Then Dane's voice cut through the barn like a whip. "Let her go, now." Wade's head whipped around. Dane stood in the barn doorway, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, his face carved from stone. The easygoing cowboy was gone, replaced by something hard and dangerous. "This is none of your business, Northwood," Wade said, but he released Delilah's arm. "When you put your hands on her, you made it my business," Dane said, his voice deadly quiet. He moved into the barn, positioning himself between Wade and Delilah. "You are going to apologize to Miss Durant, and then you are going to stay far away from her. Understood?" Wade's face flushed with rage. "You threatening me, boy? I am the foreman here. I can have you thrown off this ranch with a word to Jensen." "Try it," Dane said flatly, "but first you are going to apologize." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then Wade spat on the barn floor and turned away. "This is not over," he said, pushing past Dane and stalking out into the sunlight. Dane immediately turned to Delilah, his hard expression melting into concern. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you? "I am fine," Delilah said, but her voice was shaking. "Thank you. If you had not come when you did." "Do not think about it," Dane said, pulling her into his arms. Delilah pressed her face against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "I should have been watching more carefully. I knew he was trouble." "How did you know to come?" she asked, pulling back to look up at him. "I saw him following you toward the barn," Dane admitted. "Something about the way he moved made me nervous, so I followed. Thank God I did." "Thank God," Delilah echoed. She was trembling now, the shock catching up with her. They told Jacob and Sarah what had happened, and Jacob's face went hard with anger. "I should have dealt with Wade properly the first time," he said. "I let his skills as a foreman blind me to his character. That was a mistake." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked. "Fire him," Jacob said flatly. "I will not have a man like that working on my ranch. There are plenty of good cowboys who can do his job without terrorizing young women." True to his word, Jacob dismissed Wade that very evening, paying him his wages and telling him to be off the property by morning. Wade left without a word, but the look he gave Dane as he rode out promised trouble ahead. "Watch your back," one of the older ranch hands, Pete Martinez, warned Dane. "Wade Garrison is not the type to forget a slight. He will be looking for revenge." "Let him come," Dane said grimly. "I am not afraid of him." But the incident had shaken everyone, and Sarah insisted that Delilah not go anywhere alone on the ranch. "At least until we are sure Wade has moved on," she said. "Better safe than sorry." The weeks that followed were tense but peaceful. Wade did not return, and slowly the ranch settled back into its normal rhythms. The summer heat continued unabated, turning the hills brown and drying up the water sources. The ranch hands worked from before dawn until after dark, moving cattle to fresh grazing and maintaining the wells. Through it all, Dane and Delilah's relationship deepened. They found moments together whenever they could, walking in the early morning before the heat became unbearable, sitting on the porch after dark when the day's work was done. They talked about their hopes and fears, their pasts and their possible futures. One evening in early September, as the first hints of fall began to cool the night air, Dane asked Delilah to walk with him away from the ranch house. They climbed a low hill that overlooked the ranch, sitting on a flat rock that still held the warmth of the day's sun. Below them, the ranch house glowed with lamplight, and the sound of the ranch hands' laughter drifted up on the breeze. "I have been thinking," Dane said, taking Delilah's hand in his, "about the future, about what I want from life." "And what is that?" Delilah asked, though her heart was already racing with hope. "You," he said simply. "I want you. I want to build a life with you, to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to work hard and come home to you. I want to have children with you and grow old with you. I want everything, Delilah. Everything that two people can have together." Tears sprang to Delilah's eyes. "I want that too," she whispered. "I have wanted it since the day we met, but I was afraid to hope for it." "Do not be afraid," Dane said. He slid off the rock onto one knee, still holding her hand. "I do not have a ring to give you. I know how much your grandmother's ring meant, and I wish I could replace it with something worthy. But I can give you my heart, my loyalty, and every day of my life." "Will you marry me, Delilah Durrant? Will you take a chance on a cowboy with no prospects except love? You have more prospects than you know," Delilah said through her tears. "Yes, Dane Northwood. Yes, I will marry you." He stood and pulled her into his arms, and when he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The stars wheeled overhead, vast and brilliant in the desert sky, and Delilah thought about her grandmother's words about true love being sacrifice. But it was more than that, she realized. True love was also this: Two people choosing each other, committing to each other, promising to face whatever came together. They walked back to the ranch house hand in hand, and Sarah took one look at their faces and let out a whoop of joy. "Finally!" she exclaimed. "I have been waiting for you two to figure it out." Jacob shook Dane's hand with a grin. "Congratulations, son. You are getting a fine woman." "I know," Dane said, looking at Delilah with such love that it made her heart ache. "I am the luckiest man alive." They were married 3 weeks later in the little church in Kingston, the same church where Thomas Whitley's funeral had been held. The irony was not lost on Delilah. If she had not sacrificed her ring for his burial, Dane might never have noticed her, might never have spoken to her. That one act of selfless love had led to this. A church full of friends, a man who loved her standing at the altar, a future bright with promise. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Delilah wore a new dress that Sarah had helped her make, a soft cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. She had no ring to give Dane, and he had none to give her, but it did not matter. They spoke their vows with their hands clasped and their eyes locked, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the little church erupted in cheers. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with all the hands and their families invited. There was music and dancing, more food than Delilah had seen in years, and toasts that grew increasingly ridiculous as the evening wore on. Pete Martinez, his weathered face creased with a smile, stood and raised his glass. "To Dane and Delilah," he said. "May your love be as strong as desert mesquite and as enduring as these Nevada hills. May you have many years together and many children to fill those years with joy. And may you always remember this day, when you stood before God and everyone and promised yourselves to each other." "Hear, hear." The crowd chorused, and Delilah blinked back happy tears. As the night wore on and the celebration continued, Dane and Delilah slipped away to the small cabin that Jacob had given them as a wedding gift. It was just 2 rooms, built of adobe and timber, but it was theirs. Their home. Their beginning. Inside, by the light of a single lamp, Dane took Delilah's hands in his. "I wish I had a wedding gift for you," he said, "something to mark this day." "You are all the gift I need," Delilah said. "You and this life we are building together." "Even so," Dane said, and pulled something from his pocket. It was a small carved wooden box, rough but carefully made. "I made this. It is not much, but I thought you could keep your treasures in it. When we have the money, I am going to buy you a new ring, one that you can pass down to our children someday. But until then, this will hold that promise." Delilah opened the box and found it lined with soft cloth. Inside, carefully wrapped, was a pressed wildflower, the kind that grew along the creek where they used to walk. "Dane," she breathed, "it is perfect. I picked it the day you agreed to marry me," he explained. "I wanted to save something from that moment to remember it forever." She kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. "I do not need a ring to know you love me," she whispered. "You show me every day in 1,000 small ways. That is worth more than all the gold in Nevada." Their first months of marriage were blissful. They settled into a rhythm of domestic life, with Dane working long days on the ranch and Delilah continuing to help Sarah with the household. But now, they had their own little cabin to come home to, their own space to build a life. They cooked meals together over the small stove, sat on their tiny porch watching the sunsets, made love with a passion and tenderness that left them both breathless. As fall turned to winter, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. The joy on Dane's face when she told him was something she would treasure forever. He immediately became overprotective, insisting she not work too hard, worrying over every small discomfort. "I am not made of glass," she laughed one evening when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Not my baby, Dane said stubbornly. Not my wife. I will not take any chances. Sarah, who had raised 4 children of her own, found the whole thing amusing. Let him fuss, she told Delilah with a wink. It makes them feel useful, and enjoy it while you can, because once the baby comes, he will have plenty of real things to worry about. Winter in Nevada was cold, especially in the high desert, but the adobe walls of their cabin kept out the worst of it. They spent long evenings by the fire, Dane whittling small toys for the coming baby while Delilah sewed tiny clothes. They talked about names, about how they would raise their child, about the future they were building together. I want to teach our children about sacrifice, Delilah said one night, her hand resting on her growing belly. About how love means giving of yourself for others. That is what my grandmother taught me, and it is the most important lesson I know. We will teach them that, Dane agreed. But we will also teach them about joy, about finding happiness even in hard times, about choosing each other every day no matter what comes. I choose you, Delilah said softly. Every day, every moment I choose you. And I choose you, Dane replied, pulling her close. Always. But their peace was not to last. In February, as Delilah entered her 7th month of pregnancy, Wade Garrison returned to Kingston. Word reached the ranch quickly through Pete Martinez, who had been in town for supplies. He has been drinking and talking, Pete reported grimly, saying that Dane stole his job and his future, saying that he is going to make things right. He is going to cause trouble, Jacob said. We need to be ready. Dane wanted to ride into town and confront Wade immediately, but Jacob stopped him. That is exactly what he wants. He is looking for an excuse for a fight, and if you go to him, he can claim self-defense. We do this the smart way. We tell the sheriff, and we make sure everyone on the ranch is armed and alert. But Wade did not wait for them to come to him. 3 nights later, as the ranch slept, fire broke out in one of the hay barns. By the time anyone noticed, the structure was fully engulfed, flames leaping into the night sky. Everyone rushed to fight the fire, forming bucket brigades from the well, trying to save what they could and keep the flames from spreading to the other buildings. In the chaos, no one noticed Wade slipping toward the main house until a shot rang out, shattering a window. Delilah, who had been helping carry water despite her condition, screamed. Dane whirled around, seeing Wade standing in the yard with a revolver in his hand, his face twisted with rage and drink. "This is your fault, Northwood," Wade shouted. "You took everything from me." "Put the gun down, Wade," Dane said, moving slowly toward Delilah, trying to get between her and danger. "This is not the way." "You humiliated me," Wade fired again, the bullet kicking up dust near Dane's feet. "Made me look like a fool. Well, now you are going to watch me take away what matters to you." He swung the gun toward Delilah, and everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Dane dove toward her, trying to shield her with his body. Another shot rang out, and Dane felt a searing pain in his shoulder. He went down hard, blood spreading across his shirt. But before Wade could fire again, Pete Martinez stepped out of the shadows with his own rifle and shot the gun from Wade's hand. Other ranch hands immediately rushed forward, wrestling Wade to the ground and disarming him. Dane. Delilah was beside him, her face white with terror. "Oh God, Dane, please be all right." "I am fine," he gasped, though the pain was making his vision swim. "The baby, are you hurt?" "I am fine," she sobbed. "But you are bleeding. Someone get the doctor." Sarah and Jacob took charge, sending riders to fetch the doctor from Kingston and organizing the remaining men to finish putting out the fire and secure Wade until the sheriff could come. They carried Dane into the main house and laid him on the kitchen table while Sarah worked to stop the bleeding. "The bullet went clean through," she said after examining the wound. "That is good, but he has lost a lot of blood. We need to keep him still until the doctor arrives." Delilah sat beside him, holding his good hand,